1946, they had approximately 6 to 8% of the land. And by the way, you have here in the UK, Ilan Pappé, an amazing Israeli scholar and historian that is one of the world experts on what's sort of happened between these maps and the, sorry?
Who was that?
Ilan Pappé.
Oh, sure.
And okay, so and if you're not familiar with him, I bet at least half the people in this room are, so you could get more information. He wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, among others. Anyway, this is in 1946. In 1947, following, of course, the massacre of Jewish people throughout Europe, the United Nations proposed to give 54% of this section of historic Palestine to the Jewish people so they could create a Jewish state. And this left Palestinians with about 46% of the land. So, imagine for a moment that you are Palestinian and you're being offered by the United Nations, which doesn't own your land, you're being offered about half of what you kind of already thought was your land. This didn't seem very generous for the Palestinians. And actually, likewise, the Zionist movement had a big problem too. It was a huge gain for them. They'd lobbied for it in the United Nations, etc. But the whole point was to create a Jewish state. That was the dream, that was the intention. But the majority of the people who were living in the area where they wanted to create a Jewish state weren't Jewish. They were Muslim and they were Christian. You can't have a Jewish state with a non-Jewish majority. And so Zionist forces proceeded to expel the vast majority of the non-Jewish population from the area in what became known to Israelis as the War of Independence, but to Palestinians as a Nakba, which means the catastrophe in Arabic. And here's a map, for example, of the about 500 Palestinian villages that were razed and depopulated in the process. You can see that the expulsions went beyond that 54% in the UN partition plan into about 78%, seeing those borders that we saw on the third map, and that some still refer to today. And the refugee population, many of them went to Gaza and to the West Bank. Gaza is predominantly refugees, so if you think of the things I was talking about, what's happening in Gaza, these are people who have already lost everything. Same with many of the people living in the West Bank. So putting it even into that context, the way that this has been going on for decades and generations. Many Palestinian refugees also went to surrounding countries. There are also Palestinians here in the UK and all around the world. I met with a couple of them this morning. And many went up to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. And I traveled through some of these places trying to understand and meet with Palestinian refugees to understand better their situation and their feelings. And I found many of them still carry their papers with them, their land deeds or their house titles, and they say, we didn't sell it. It's it's still there, and it's 100 or 200 kilometers away, but we can't go to it just because we're not Jewish. And then some of the refugees I met even still have their keys to their homes. And this man, he told me his story. He said it was total chaos, guns, shooting, and they locked their doors and ran for their lives, expecting they'll be back in a couple of weeks or when the fighting ends. And now, more than 60 years later, he and his family and the millions more like his have never been allowed to return to their homes and lands. And what's so shocking to me personally is that I can go to his land, right? I'm Jewish. Israel's supposedly the state of all Jewish people. So Israel would actually pay me to leave my life of basic comfort in the United States to move on to his land. I could buy his land, I could lease his land, I could farm his land. If his house is still there, I could live in his house on his land. He can't even visit because he's not Jewish. And there's so much discussion about the obviousness of a Jewish state, right? What does it mean if having a Jewish state requires the perpetual discrimination against non-Jews for eternity? Everyday people, just because they're not Jewish. And what does it mean when we talk about the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state? What does it mean to ask this man, do you recognize the right for there to be a state on your historic homeland that explicitly excludes you and your children and your whole community? If he says, I don't think there's a right for that, does that make him an anti-Semite? Does that make him unreasonable to negotiate with? Or is that a pretty unfair condition to place on people for them to relinquish their rights? So that's kind of the context we don't often hear, at least in the United States, but probably here too. I haven't yet talked about sort of the third category, if you will, of Palestinians, the ones in the 1967 occupied territories, the refugee population, but there are also Palestinians within 1948 Israel with Israeli citizenship, and they themselves suffer the consequences of being non-Jews in a Jewish state. Here, for example, is a village of Al-Araqib that has been demolished more than 25 times. It may be up to 30, 35 now. I haven't checked the latest numbers. But time and time again, the people of Al-Araqib rebuild their homes and are targeted. They're in what's called an unrecognized village, which means that Israel basically says, you don't exist. Your village doesn't exist. We will provide nothing to you, even though you are taxpayers, even though you've been here for generations and generations, since far before Israel was created. And this perhaps should be not surprising, because Israel is not the state of its citizens. Even if we look at the flag, what does it mean for a non-Jew to live under this flag? Israel is not the state of the citizens in the way that the UK is the state of UK citizens, or the United States is the state of Americans. Israel is not the state of Israelis. Israel is the state of the Jewish people, no matter where they live, everyone around the world. Israel is the state of a whole bunch of people who are not its citizens, like me, and it's not the state of a whole bunch of people who are its citizens, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are discriminated against in many ways that I'm not even touching on today. And so this really begins to dissect a bit this notion of a Jewish state and what it means in terms of being democratic. Many would say that is an oxymoron. So we're back at these maps, and a lot of, I think these are useful maps in the way that they tell this story, but I've met Palestinians who don't really like those maps because they look like a sort of historic thing, as opposed to these maps, which show the way in which this is not something that happened before. This is something happening every single second, every minute of every hour of every day, and that it will continue unless something is done about it. And that comes to then us and what we can do. And frankly, I'm excited about what's already happening in this area. And I think it's important to say that, if you left this presentation today feeling, sad for Palestinians, feeling sorry for them, I would consider that I had failed you in some way, that this was a failure, because Palestinians don't need more sympathy. They have a lot of sympathy. They need people to take action, to get involved, to actually begin to make change or to participate in making change. And it's happening already. It's exciting, and it's a great thing to get involved in. So what can you do? Guess what I'm going to say. That was supposed to come up next. It was going to be like but anyway, one of the things that you can do just here on campus, it exists already. It's a great group, Sussex Friends of Palestine. There were, I think, at least 2/3 of the people here when we raised our hands aren't part of it yet, and I cannot stress enough how great it would be for people to get involved in this group, doing wonderful things that I can talk about. Maybe I'll take actually a second to ask you guys, what are some things that people can do from right here? And are we in Falmer? What are we in technically? In the Brighton area. What are some things that people can do here? Or are we powerless? Yeah.
Boycotting. I think boycotting is very important. Boycotting Israeli settlements, boycotting Israeli products. I think it's very important due to their economy, could affect their economy, could show them that people are actually taking action. So I think this is a very easy, accessible way for everyone to actually do something about it. And I encourage it to everyone. It's very good.
Wonderful. Great. Now we'll talk about maybe other things. Did you have your hand?
Okay. What they can do, they can come to help us if it's at a place. Is it them?
Yeah.
If it's for more comfort time,
Well, basically, we're talking about just one tiny part of the boycott. But SodaStream, Israeli company, which is based in an illegal settlement, has actually opened a shop in Brighton called EcoStream. A lot of you know this place and have been standing outside it leafleting every Saturday. Basically, they produce carbonating systems for water, and they're portraying themselves as a green alternative to buying bottles of soda water. But because they're based in a settlement, they're getting the financial incentives to set up the company in a settlement. They're actually paying their taxes to maintain the settlement. They are actually expanding the settlement, which means that Bedouin people round about are being ethnically cleansed to make room for the expansion of the settlement. And their shop in Brighton is called Eco Stream, and it's on 142 Western Road, and we picket it every single Saturday and sometimes during the week as well, and persuade people not to go and buy their stuff. And I'm very happy to say that you hardly ever see anybody in there. It's not only because of us, but it's because people in Brighton have got good sense, I think. But we do meet quite a lot of opposition from local Zionists. But we're sticking in there until the shop closes. So that could be a long time. But your help would be most appreciated. And you can sign a petition as you go to close Eco Stream. So that's a tiny example of one little practical thing that can be done.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say not just boycott products, but I think cultural boycott is important as well, because basically...
Don't just talk to me.
Okay.
Here, I'll sit down.
Yeah, basically, because Israel's trying to legitimize itself on the international stage through lots of cultural exchanges and performances, and oh, Israel's a great place, we've got dancing troops, and it's a great holiday destination, so and also so I support the cultural boycott to stop Israeli groups coming here, and also if your favourite band's playing in Israel, write to them and persuade them not to perform at Israeli festivals and stuff. So.
Fantastic. And the cultural boycott, if people have more questions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. But cultural boycott is something that the UK has been really successful in. For example, getting Faithless, or maybe they didn't need much convincing, but the band Faithless to support the boycott, to not go to Israel for political reasons. I believe the Pixies also canceled an event there or came out in support in some way. Emma Thompson, I think, is in support as well, an actor, and there are others as well. And in many ways, the cultural boycott of Israel is sort of the weak spot. Because just like you were saying, Israel fancies itself as really a beacon of progressive democracy in the arts and academia, and in many ways being unable to showcase that, to brand itself, as they even themselves call it, rebranding Israel, because their old image of being a victim and being angelic is no longer sustainable. Now it's a cultural haven. Really makes Israeli headlines. It really affects people in a way that sometimes other tactics don't as poignantly. Other ideas? We get one or two more and then move on.
I was going to say, obviously getting involved with groups and stuff is a really good idea and really nice, but also I think it's quite important to chat to friends who may not be interested in it previously and do it in a way so it's not necessarily threatening or intimidating, because I think a lot of people feel like, oh, I don't know anything about it and therefore I don't want to get involved. I think just having a night in with some friends and watching a documentary about it and just kind of having a nice friendly conversation about it is nice and involves people who may not previously be interested. So including everybody into the discussion, I think, is really important.
Wonderful. And then we'll get one more.
I think very, very often people at the BBC who like to think of themselves as broad-minded actually use terms like they killed an activist or something like that, rather they just killed a person. I think there's a lot of quite offensive language used almost unconsciously by our media. But I suspect, because the Muslim Society, someone asked how many people have ever written to the BBC to complain. I think I was the only one. And I think we should complain. I think we should complain quite regularly that, this is insidious, because a lot of the people that aren't here are people that don't actually realise this is going on, and it's the very language, I think, that's being used. Sort of quite, this whole nonsense about the cartoon yesterday being somehow anti-Semitic, when it quite obviously wasn't. But just the fact that BBC will cover that as though it's an issue, when it's actually diverting. So I think regular complaints about the angle of some news stories would be helpful.
And I met with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Executive Committee in London yesterday, and they told me about one of the things that they do, which I guess is sort of monitoring the media and then doing research and giving people like yourself and others the information to be able to write in, knowing who to write to, knowing the specific research being done, pointing out errors, etc. And it sounds like it's had some success, having a large number of people writing in at once. So it sounded great, and I'm going to sort of bring the idea back to the U.S. too. So I agree. Okay, terrific. So you guys kind of said a lot of it. But the Palestinian civil society, more than 170 civil society organizations inside and outside Palestine of Palestinians, made a call in 2005 for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until Israel complies with 3 basic demands that would fulfill the basic human rights of the Palestinian people. Number 1, ending the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Number 2, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And number 3, the right of return of Palestinian refugees as affirmed year after year by the international community, an inalienable right of the refugees. And this movement has had incredible success, in particular in the United Kingdom, which is one reason I was excited to be here, because things are really happening here, and you're quite lucky to be in many ways at one of the centers of this movement. And it's very broad. It's in the United States. In fact, that's basically my domain, is that I work for a coalition called the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, which is a coalition of about 400 groups around the country working on this issue, and many different BDS campaigns are sprouting, are having success. Many of them overlap with campaigns here. One of the targets of BDS campaigns, and by the way, there's boycotts, which we talked about, consumer, cultural, there's academic, sports. There's also divestment, the opposite of investment, to stop investing in companies that are profiting from Palestinian suffering. And one of the biggest divestment and boycott targets is Veolia, which is a French multinational corporation that is profiting in many ways from the occupation. It offers bus services on those Jewish-only roads that I showed. It's involved in the Jerusalem Light Rail, a tramway connecting 1948 Israel with the illegal settlements in the West Bank to sort of institutionalize and further entrench those colonies. It provides other services to illegal settlements in terms of water, waste management. It has a landfill. It operates a landfill on Palestinian land, etc. Here you can see some of the exact routes, and this actually I got from a friend of mine who profits from the Israeli occupation, whoprofits.org, and you can find lots and lots of information about every company involved in the occupation. So it's a great resource. Student activism. So many of you are already doing it, but historically students have played a leading role in social justice movements throughout history, and so it's really very important for students to be involved. It is an inspiration to people around the world to see the future of these countries getting so involved. And in the U.S. also, we have a very vast network of Students for Justice in Palestine that are really taking the lead, along with some other communities, on this issue. So there's much that can be accomplished. So Sheffield and Cambridge have voted to end a Veolia contract. These are just some that I heard about recently. King's College in London didn't renew a deal